Today we're going to practice dividing decimals. Our goal is to apply and extend previous understanding of division problems to the division of decimals. So today we're going to take what we already know about dividing and apply it to dividing decimals. This, of course, you've had previous tutorials helping you with the division of decimals. So let's first review some common mistakes. Some common mistakes, of course, kids make forgetting to accurately place the decimal. So they forget about the decimal altogether. They'll just say, oh, 12 divided by 4/10 is 3. So it is important that you move the decimal over when you multiply something like this in order to get 3/10. So misplacing the dividend and the divisor is also a common mistake. 3/100ths divided by 6/10. We can see how we properly write it. Now, a common mistake is students will mix up the dividend and the divisor. So we notice that those are not the correct ways of setting up the problem. So those are things to always ask yourself when you get an answer that doesn't seem to make sense. Another important thing to remember is that multiplication and division problems are inverse operations. In other words, 45 divided by 9 is the same as saying 9 times what is 45, or something times 9 is 45. So it's always important to remember them as kind of a triangle of information. Another thing to remember is how to multiply by a power of 10. So we have 100th times 10. Well, we remember from our base 10 blocks 1/10 as shown, and we would do that 10 times. So we have 1 time, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 times. So I can see that when I multiply these together, I have 1/10. And of course we remember from our base 10 systems that one stick represents 1/10. One of these hundredths represents one whole, and then the smaller pieces, of course, represent thousandths, as shown in the previous example. So again, we have 1/10. So when we multiply by a power of 10, we can see that there's a pattern. If we move the decimal over, we can actually get that answer. So that's and it has to be to the right if we're multiplying by 10. When we divide, remember we can move it to the left. If you're struggling with multiplying or dividing by a power of 10, there's other tutorials that can help you with that. Let's look at another example. So we can see when we multiplied 100th times 10th, we got 1/10. Now when we multiply 1/10 10 times, of course I can see that I have 1 time, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I get 1 whole, or 1. And we, of course, remember that 100 is 1 whole. So that's reviewing using some visual aids. Now let's start with dividing with decimals. So how do we divide these decimals? I have 1 8/10 divided by 2/10. So what I really need to ask myself is, how many groups of 2/10 are in 1 8/10? So I can, of course, count by 2/10, 4/10, 6/10, 8/10, etc. And I know, of course, that 9 groups of 2 give me 18. So when I count by 2/10, of course, I can see that, well, 9 groups of 2/10 will give me 1 8/10. And the way we can, of course, check that is by saying 1 8/10 divided by 2/10. And then what you need to do is basically multiply both the dividend and the divisor by the same number, in this case 10. And of course 10 divided by 10 is 1 whole, so that's why you're not changing the value. So you can, of course, rewrite that as 18 divided by 2, which would give you 9. So there are 9 groups of 2/10 in 1 8/10. Let's look at another example. So we have 21 divided by 7/100ths. So a good thing to do is to first rewrite the division problem in a simpler way. So if we had 21 and we divided it by 7/100ths, remember, it would look this way. Don't get them confused. That's a very common mistake. And then I notice that I can multiply 1, 2. So I can multiply it by 100 on both sides in order to get 2,100 divided by 7. Now I have something I can easily divide. So 7 can't go into 2, but it can go into 21 3 times. And then, of course, I can bring down my zeros. And that would give me 300. So that means, of course, 7/100ths. If I multiply that, we can see that there are 300 groups. So this is something that you really want to note when you have nothing after the decimal. You don't just move the decimal. You start, of course, at the very end, and you move it twice. Now, what do you do when you have nothing there? You add zeros. Let's look at another example. So we have 196 and 8/10 divided by 1 2/10. Well, I can see it doesn't matter if I have a decimal over here in my dividend, but I don't want it in my divisor. So I know I'm going to want to move it one place over or multiply by 10, and whatever I do to that side, I need to do the same to the other side. So that gives me 1,968 divided by 12. So now I can use my long division skills, and I can figure out the answer. So that gives me 164. If you need to review your division, make sure you're going and looking at other tutorials to help you as well. Let's look at one final example where we can really look at these as groups. How can we divide 162 and 8/10 by 4? So what I'm asking is how many groups of 4 are in 162 and 8/10? Now I notice that I have a decimal only in my dividend. So that means I don't really have to do anything other than bring the decimal up. So I can just divide as usual when I have problems like this. If there's no decimal in my divisor, then I'm okay. 4 can't go into 1, but it can go into 16. And of course now I can multiply as usual. 4 can't go into 2, but it can go into 28 7 times. And so when I'm looking for a multiplication menu, I can see that each group, of course, is going to be 40 and 7/10. So 1 times 40 and 7/10 is 40 and 7/10. So I know one group is 40 and 7/10, and now I can work with my next groups. 2 groups, of course, would be 81 and 4/10. 3 groups, 122 and 1/10. And of course, 4 groups would be 162 and 8/10. So those are some ways that you can, of course, think of division as repeated subtraction and also multiplication as repeated addition. So I've cleaned these numbers up so that it's easier for you to copy them down into your notes if you need to. Now I want you to write down these 3 problems and practice them on your own. Remember to change any decimals in the dividend to numbers that are easy to work with. Multiply by 10, multiply by 100, multiply by 1,000, for example. And make sure whatever you do with the dividend, you do with the divisor as well. So go ahead and take a minute to pause and write down your guided practice problems and practice them on your own. So another great job today. Remember to always make sure that you're checking your work, especially with division of decimals. Always make sure to ask yourself, do these answers make sense? And you can always estimate to check to see if they make sense. Also, another thing to remember is that you don't get your dividend and your divisor mixed up when you're rewriting the problem. Finally, use multiplication by tens, hundreds, thousands in order to get rid of your decimals when rewriting your problems. So another great job today. Again, use other tutorials if you need extra help. Great work again today.